The origins of the Cold War are widely regarded to lie most directly in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Allies, which consisted of the United States, Great Britain, and France. The Cold War can be traced all the way back to the Russian Civil War in 1917. Rebels who called themselves the Bolsheviks or the working class overthrew their government. The Bolshevik leader was Joseph Stalin, who praised a communist and socialist state. Stalin often criticized capitalistic societies. The United States first became suspicious of the USSR in response to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact was made between the USSR and Germany during the beginning of World War II. The pact created an important economic relationship between USSR and Germany. The pact also secretly split Poland in half, the East for the USSR and the West for Germany. However, this pact was broken when Germany tried to invade the USSR. Stalin switched his cooperation from Adolf Hitler to Winston Churchill of England. Tensions rose even higher at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. The conference discussed how Nazi Germany would be split up. President Harry S. Truman succeeded Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. Truman and Stalin had many different ideas regarding the division of Germany. Eventually, Germany was split up to democratically controlled West Germany and communist-controlled East Germany. This formed the Iron Curtain and started the Cold War. The United States and other Western democracies, called the Western Bloc, practiced the idea of containment, in which they would contain communism and eventually eradicate it. However, the Soviets and their allies, named the Eastern Bloc, their goal was to spread communism. In order to gain momentum in the idea of containment, Truman unveiled the Truman Doctrine in March of 1947, which gave $400 million to Greece and Turkey to help them avoid Soviet control. The Truman Doctrine led to the creation of the Marshall Plan, which gave aid to European countries destroyed by World War II. However, in order to receive this aid, countries had to embrace democracy. Tensions began to rise even higher between the West and the East. In July of 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947. He created the Department of Defense and then the Central Intelligence Agency, better known as the CIA. With the creation of the CIA, the Soviets tried to compete with the KGB, their form of intelligence. The Soviets realized that the U.S. was gaining influence in Germany. In response, Stalin created the Berlin Blockade in July of 1948. This blockade prevented West Berlin from receiving food, materials, and supplies. In response of that, the Western Bloc countries began the Berlin Airlift. A year later, the blockade was lifted. Back in the United States, a phenomenon of fear and paranoia took place. This was referred to as the Red Scare. Government officials were afraid of spies in the government feeding information to the USSR. In 1947, Truman set up a number of anti-communist committees, panels, and loyalty review boards in both federal and state governments. He also created many private agencies to carry out these investigations for small and large companies concerned about the possible communists in their workforce. This action was dubbed Executive Order 9835. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower took office in 1953, he strengthened and extended Truman's loyalty review program. During the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy headed the Senate Subcommittee of Investigation. He was famous for his blacklist, which began in the Hollywood industry. He believed that the MPAA was subliminally trying to promote communism. The practice of McCarthyism led to the victimization of over 15,000 Americans and left many more jobless and ostracized from their communities. Then, in 1954, the Senate censored Joseph McCarthy, ruling his methods unconstitutional. Dwight D. Eisenhower revolutionized the U.S. national security policy in 1953. His main priorities were maintaining the U.S. economy, relying on nuclear weapons to stop communist aggression, and fighting a nuclear war, using the CIA to carry out secret missions against government or leaders who were responsible for Soviet control, and strengthening allies and winning the friendship of non-aligned countries. Eisenhower's defense policies aimed at providing efficiency by cutting spending on conventional forces while increasing the budget of the Air Force and nuclear weapons technology. President John F. Kennedy was the president after Dwight D. Eisenhower. Unlike Eisenhower, he funded conventional armed forces along with the Air Force. Back in Germany in 1961, the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, renewed tensions with the U.S. by threatening to take Berlin back to East Germany. Kennedy responded with the Ich mein Berliner speech. Then the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. In the U.S., Kennedy was fighting a war against Cuban forces led by communist Fidel Castro. On April 17, 1961, Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was an embarrassing failure. In response, Castro publicly embraced communism to humiliate the U.S.'s failure even further. October of 1962, the CIA confirmed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. This was the closest the U.S. has ever came to nuclear war and mutual assured destruction, or MAD. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade on Cuba. However, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles only if the U.S. would not invade Cuba and that we would remove our nuclear arsenal from Turkey. The Cold War in Asia began in China. In 1949, Chinese leader Mao Zedong's forces, called the People's Liberation Army, defeated U.S.-backed Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek and his forces retreated to the island of Taiwan. In response, Truman initiated NSC-68. This document was classified at the time. However, it was later declassified. NSC-68 was Truman's plan on defense. It sent more money to democratic nations and quadrupled spending and investments in defense and the CIA. It also created alliances with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines, helping the U.S. create military bases in case of an attack. In 1950, North Korean forces, led by Kim Il-sung and funded by the Soviets, invaded South Korea. South Korean forces were led by Syngman Rhee. Kim's army attacked the South in June of 1950, almost conquering the entire peninsula. The U.S. military returned to Korea, leading a United Nations authorized force to push the North's army back above the 38th parallel and beyond. In September of 1951, the U.S. signed the United States-Japanese Security Treaty. The treaty allowed the U.S. to station troops in Japan, making Japan a vital ally in the Cold War. Finally, in 1953, North Korea and South Korea reached an uneasy truce and created an armistice. The 38th parallel is where the border between North and South Korea remains even today. In 1956, the Vietnam War began. The war was fought between North Vietnam, supported by the USSR and China, and the South Vietnamese government, backed by the U.S. The U.S. government viewed American involvement in the war as a way to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. This was better known as the domino theory, which stated that if one state went communist, other states in the region would follow. U.S. involvement escalated further following the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which a U.S. destroyer clashed with the North Vietnamese fast attack craft. This was followed by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the U.S. President authorization to increase U.S. military presence. However, direct U.S. military involvement ended on August 15, 1973 as a result of the Case-Church Amendment passed by the U.S. Congress. The capture of Saigon at the hands of the North Vietnamese Army in April of 1975 marked the end of the war. North and South Vietnam were reunified the following year. Between 1965 and 1975, the United States spent $111 billion on the war. In 1985 and 1991, it can be debated that these are the final years of the Cold War. The Soviet economy could not keep up with its communist ways and lost the strength of its currency. Then, in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The U.S. saw this as not only the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the eventual fall of the USSR. Then, in December of 1991, the USSR was officially dissolved. The Cold War was an important influence on almost all aspects of American society. Cultural differences between the United States and the Soviet Union had both positive and negative effects. Mutual fear between the two countries led to political confrontations, some of which nearly led to another world war. Differing economic philosophies resulted in opposing claims of what freedom meant, and economic competition led to massive military spending by both countries. Because of its broad influence, the Cold War was the defining event of the second half of the 20th century and impacted, to varying extents, almost all American foreign and domestic policy decisions that took place later on that century.